Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Good Growth Podcast. We have a very special guest on today's episode. I have plenty of topics of conversation to cover. So let's get right to it. I'm delighted to welcome former party leader, Member of Parliament for the Liberal Democrats, and Cabinet Minister Sir Vince Cable. Thank you very much for joining me.
Morning. Delighted to join you.
And how are you? Are you well?
I'm very well. I'm one of these rather privileged people that I have my home in Twickenham and my wife has a little farm in the New Forest. So I'm afraid lockdown has been a privilege, actually. We've been able to enjoy the wonders of the English countryside, some of the most beautiful parts of it. And, I feel rather guilty and a bit sorry for the people who are penned into multi-storey flats and crowded apartments. But anyway, that's the way it goes.
Yes,
I've been able to do useful things.
Absolutely. The theme of this series of the podcast has largely been around innovation. And that's a topic I'd like to start off with today, as you come from a strong economic and business background. Your role in the cabinet from 2010 to 15 was as the Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills. And during that time, you supported innovation as a route out of the financial crisis that preceded that government, namely in the form of opening a series of innovation centres that were termed catapults. Can you tell us a little bit about the catapults and the decision to use them or invest in them as a means of emerging from the financial crisis?
Yes, I think the innovation centres, the catapults, was one of the success stories of the coalition. And the old adage that success has many authors and failure has none. Quite a lot of people would claim credit for launching the catapult network, but I perhaps inevitably tend to stress my own role in it. Basically what happened when I came into government, that there had been a very good report by a man called Hermann Hauser, who was a venture capitalist in Cambridge, a German, very familiar with the German Fraunhofer model, and had written a report advocating the creation of some kind of Fraunhofer network in the UK. When I became Secretary of State, I think there were two things that propelled me towards his thinking. The first was on the first day in the office, somebody got through on my mobile. It was Will Hutton, who I knew a little bit. And he said, he tried to, as he does, rather press on me a whole set of ideas, which I should implement tomorrow. But said one thing I should do above all was listen to the people who are arguing for the German-style innovation centres as a way of propelling innovation and growth. And the other thing which I became quickly aware of was that we had an early round of cuts in the departmental budget. And I realised that there was a very strange feature of the British budgeting system, that research was protected. There was what's called a ring fence around academic research. But innovation was separately funded and unprotected, and came under an organization called the Technology Strategy Board that seemed to be doing admirable work, but was subject to severe cuts and was unprotected. So I determined to reverse that. No, not reverse it, to continue to protect science, but to give innovation more of a security financial status. And on the back of that, I encouraged the idea of innovation centres. They weren't called catapults at that point. And we started by pulling together the 7 centres of advanced manufacturing research centred on Sheffield, but there were very good centres in Teesside, Coventry, the Materials Institution in Bristol, a forming centre in Strathclyde, University Glasgow, and Professor Bhattacharya's outfit in Warwick. And that was the basis of it. And then subsequently, I got money from the Treasury to provide core funding, not just for them, but for a whole set of new catapults as they became. It started with cell therapy at Guy's in London. And then we had space applications at Harwell. new renewables centre in Glasgow, in Strathclyde University, and the NARIC Centre in the northeast. And then some somewhat more fanciful, you might think, but certainly wide-ranging catapults, one to do with new transport systems that was based in Milton Keynes, the future of cities, which was in London, a digital centre in King's Cross. And then I got into a bit of a battle with the science community because I thought too much was happening in London. And so put up a fight to demand that new centres should be located more widely around the country. And partly on the back of that, we got a energy saving innovation based in Birmingham, precision medicine, which was in Cheshire, the outskirts of Manchester, and eventually a unit concerned with semiconductors, which was in Cardiff. So we got a regional spread. But that was the concept, and the original idea was that a third of the money comes from the government, core funding, a third is commercial consultancy, and the other third was to come from collaborative ventures with universities, the European Union, and other private sector interests.
And were you able to observe any initial impacts from those innovation catapults? What were you able to see in the time, at least you're in government?
Oh, I think the advanced manufacturing catapult had an immediate impact and was really light. I mean, I went round them all, and there was real enthusiasm by local businesses. They'd never had anything quite like this before. That technical problems that they needed resolving were helped through the catapult network. The others were in a formative stage. It was very difficult to judge them. Subsequent government inquiries, there was a big investigation into the catapults 2017, had a sort of mixed verdict that the advanced manufacturing catapults have been a great success. Some of the more focused catapults, like satellite applications, were doing very well, which probably accounts in part for this recent acquisition the government has made in the space industry. But the somewhat vaguer manifestos of, say, the cities, future cities and transport systems, and even digital, were not thought to be highly successful. And several of them have been amalgamated to make them more efficient, and they've been put on a somewhat different business model. But they're still there. As far as I'm aware, that the network is expanding. It is regarded overall as a considerable success.
And what do you think today's government can learn from this in terms of how they help businesses move forward and protect the economy through what is going to be inevitably a very tricky spell?
Well, I suppose the message I'm giving to the present government is, don't reinvent the wheel. I mean, there are a lot of good things happened. It may have been in this case a coalition government, Lib Dem minister, but that's not a reason for burying it. And many of the ideas we had within the industrial strategy, of which the catapult network was one, have survived the test of time, and they should build on it. And if Britain is going to be a success story, it needs to have more innovation to drive productivity. We've got a big model here. It's two elements to it, really: government and the private sector working together and taking a long-term view. I mean, those are the basic ideas we took from the Germans. And I would hope the government is wise enough to invest in this network.
Moving on to the EU and leaving the EU, as the country has done, and the transition period is now coming to an end. Very much been second focus this year because of the global pandemic, but it has to be noted that this is still going on. The deadlines are fast approaching, which, as I said, we're transitioning to a new set of rules for businesses and for citizens from 2021 onwards. Is there a real prospect now of us exiting without a deal? And what do you see being the implications of a no-deal exit, in particular for businesses?
Well, there certainly is a possibility, because both sides are talking about it and preparing the public for that eventuality. I've always taken the view that it was unlikely. I always thought we would leave the European Union. That was a bad thing. And I always thought it would happen on the basis of a negotiated agreement. And that's still my view, even though we've probably got a week or so before we'll know the final outcome. If it does happen that there is a no-deal exit, there will be several consequences which are different from having a deal, albeit a very thin one, which is currently under discussion. There will be an immediate impact on those sectors of the economy where there are significant tariffs. The car industry is one, which is pretty vulnerable at the moment. And the other is bits of agriculture, dairy, beef, which will suffer terrible damage if there is a no-deal Brexit leading to the imposition of full tariffs. And the other consequence, I think, is that there will be a lot of acrimony and blaming each other. And that will then make it very difficult to return to the negotiating table and build up a deal sometime next year. Because even if we get a very thin deal, as seems likely, and there will be quite a lot of disruption and a lot of costs, it's then possible to build on it and to address some of the areas which are currently slipping through the cracks, like security. And it would be possible to, integrate Britain backwards into the single market, probably in a slightly stealthy way, given the politics of the government. But that can't happen, I think, if there is a fractious break at the end of this year.
And I guess talking of fractious relationships, I want to move on to talk about China, because China are a fascinating country to talk about. So, and you've recently published a book on China and the need for the Western world to engage with them. Why do countries like the UK and the US need to engage with China?
Well, as a preface, just let's say I'm not a China expert, and I had to deal extensively with China when I was president of the Board of Trade within the coalition. I've always been interested in it. I did quite a lot of appraisal work when I was in Shell 20, 30 years ago for their big investment projects in China. Now, why is it essential that we engage? Well, the first reason is simple reality. China is probably, depending on how you measure it, the biggest economy in the world. It's growing relative to the Western world. It will, I think, continue to happen. I mean, there are what are called China bears who think that they will hit the buffers, but they've been repeatedly confounded. So I think China will become almost certainly a bigger and bigger player within the world economy. And, given that our interests in trade and investment, we have to engage with that. I think the second reason is that contrary to a lot of the kind of propaganda around in the West and the tone of a lot of Chinese comment, China is actually becoming an easier place to do business. For some years, it's been an easier place for companies to operate than, say, India or Brazil, a more open economy, albeit, protectionist in some areas and given the sensitivities around their so-called Great Firewall. But in general, a more open economy, easier to invest in. Things like intellectual property rights, which were treated in a fairly cavalier way, are now better dealt with. Foreign companies are winning more cases. The World Bank considers China to be an easier country to do business in than even countries like Italy and Europe. So that's a second factor. And I think the third is what you might call public goods. I mean, there are a lot of problems in the world that we need to cooperate with other countries to deal with. Climate change is one. The current development crisis based on debt in Africa. The need to protect against future pandemics. I mean, we need cooperation to do that. And we may not like the Chinese model and the rather undemocratic methods and suppressions of civil liberties, but they are there and they have to be dealt with. And I think, to my mind, one of the most crucial developments in recent times, is largely ignored in the West, is that the democratic countries of Asia, Japan and Korea most notably, have just signed up to a big trade agreement with China called the RCEP. The assumption was, certainly in Britain, that they would gather around some kind of anti-Chinese alliance, both in trade and military matters, and gang up on China. That absolutely no sign of that. The big Asian countries recognize reality. They recognize that China is number one, and they've got to deal with them, and they deal with them in a business-like way, and we've got to follow their example.
What do you think are the potential implications if we weren't to engage? I mean, there's a case, I guess, to separate Western countries and Western economies from China, and almost say, well, we'll go about doing our business, and whatever China does, China does.
Yes, I mean, there is a little bit of that decoupling approach. We're certainly in the United States following Trump's trade policy, and you're getting a bit of that from a lobby group of British Conservative MPs, the China Research Group, Ian Duncan Smith and others, who want to detach ourselves from China. But there is quite a powerful counter tendency. I mean, I did argue in the book that the model we should be looking at is Chancellor Merkel in Germany. She's been to China 15 times, I think, mainly trade promotion, and the Germans are doing very well in China. But also, trying to engage with them on big international problems, and finding, as I found when I was a minister, that you can talk to them privately about human rights issues. They have a different position on it. But if you're just haranguing them and finger wagging, I mean, this just causes friction and doesn't achieve anything.
So they are open to talking and to conversation. It's just, as with everyone, there's ways to go about it.
I mean, I was there 5 years ago. Things have changed, and Xi, the new president, is more authoritarian and intolerant figure than these predecessors seem to have been. But I found that if you could talk to party secretaries at provincial level, of very powerful people, and members of the Politburo, standing committee, as it's called, you could talk to them about, I had some good conversations about trade union rights. Why didn't they have them in China? And they would argue back. And they're very bright people. I mean, this is not like the old Soviet Union, run by very old and rigidly minded people. I mean, the Chinese elite are the best of their generation, extraordinarily smart people, and they're perfectly capable of holding their own in debate.
Do you think the election of Joe Biden in the US, or pending election, offers optimism that the Western world can now successfully cooperate with China a bit more than perhaps in the previous?
Well, it will certainly be more polite, and we'll have less of the aggrandizement that you got from Trump and the tweets and insults flying backwards and forwards. It will be traditional diplomatic ways of exchange, and that is an improvement. But I don't think it necessarily changes anything for two reasons. One is that Biden's instincts are very much to promote liberal democracy, good for him in values terms, but the Chinese clearly don't buy that, and they think they've got a better model. And if Biden tries to do what Trump signally failed to do, and that's create an alliance of like-minded countries with the Europeans, with India, to come in behind Taiwan to try to confront China, that could actually make things more difficult. And on the Chinese side, I suspect that they may take the view that Biden is a more civilized communicator, but probably of short duration. I mean, the Chinese think in very long term, and they probably assume that in 4 years' time we're going to get another Trump-type Republican. They're going to be back where they have been. So why should they take Biden all that seriously? I fear that may well happen. And although I think Biden is, great for restoring some faith in Western democracy, I suspect his influence will be more limited, and that the improvement in Chinese relations will not happen.
So, thank you. So your new book, China, Engage, Avoid the New Cold War, it's available on Amazon now, paperback copies, hard copies, and available to download onto your Kindle or other devices. Looking ahead, then, you have another book to be published early next year, titled Money and Power, and that's appears as though it look at the relationship between economics and politics. Can you tell us a little bit about that book? And it seems to be focusing particularly on prominent world leaders.
Yeah, it's a much more serious book than the China piece. I mean, I wrote the China piece in a great hurry, about 3 months. Thought it was very topical. I pulled together what I knew. But Money and Power has been in gestation for several years. And I guess it's a work of economic history, or economic and political history. I mean, essentially what I've tried to do is to look at all the major political figures over the last 2 centuries who've changed the way we think about economic matters. I mean, I think I've often found frustrating is that when you talk about economics, it's all about the economists. It's about Keynes and Milton Friedman and people like this. But actually, as somebody who's been an economist and a politician, I know that what matters ultimately are the politicians, because they're the people who implement the policy, and you've got to understand where they come from and what their constraints are. So I looked at economic history from the standpoint of the politicians. I started with Alexander Hamilton in America, who laid the foundations really for modern America over 200 years ago. I went on to Peel in the UK as a politician, very opportunistic politician. He wasn't an economic thinker at all, but who made one of the biggest transformations, which was converting Britain into a free trading country. And then at Bismarck, who again wasn't interested in economics, but did some of the most profound changes in European economic policy. The Zollverein, which is the forerunner of the European Union, promoted protected industrialization in Germany and launched the first welfare state. And then I moved on to Lenin, again, not an obvious economist, but his state capitalism, which was his new economic policy, was the template for what eventually became the big reforms in China and elsewhere. Then I dealt with Roosevelt, and then moved on to the post-war era, key figures like Erhard, the author of the German economic miracle, on to Mrs. Thatcher, Deng Xiaoping, Lee Kuan Yew, General Park, who presided over the Korean breakthrough. And indeed, my modern figures are predominantly Asian, because in a way that reflects the reality of the modern world. And I finished up with Abenomics, after Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, who has actually been transformational. I think we've noticed the way that Japan has been turned around in the last few years. And slightly cheekily, I did Trump at the end. Not that he's a great figure in any way, but Trumponomics, protectionism, economic nationalism, we may not like it, but he has put it on the map, and maybe as a permanent feature.
So it sounds like there's a real variety of different economic changes and policies that these leaders have, I guess, pioneered in some ways. Over the course.
Yes, I'm not concerned with goodies and baddies. I mean, I'm not making value judgments. I'm basically saying, these are highly influential people who changed the way the world worked, and we should remember them and understand what they did.
Well, it's been brilliant talking to you about various different topics here, but I'd like to talk finish by talking a little bit about yourself. You stepped down from Parliament just before the last general election. Where does your time and focus lie now? You talked about the book, so it sounds like you're incredibly busy. What other things are going on at the moment?
Well, apart from, just enjoying life more and spending more time with Rachel, my wife, and enjoying the countryside and doing lots of cycling and walking, I'm writing mainly. I have a weekly column in The Independent. I'm working on these books, quite apart from the ones we've described. I'm doing what I call the decade of disillusion, the story of the last decades seen in Britain. What I've done is I've started at the beginning of the coalition, 2010, and put together my own source material. I've got quite an impressive collection of press cuttings, together with Rachel's diaries, and basically telling the story of that period, which I think will be of some interest, at least within my party. How we got where we were. I've got to roughly halfway point in the coalition, the Olympics, and then I will probably release a series of volumes. It's not intended for mass circulation, but as a sort of niche product, a bit of modern history, I think will interest some people.
Certainly does sound interesting. So Vince, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. That just about does it in terms of time, but thank you. Could talk to you for a lot longer if I could. So, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Thank you.